On the 14th of March, 2023, a single administrative document was published in Spain's Boletín Oficial del Estado, the official state gazette where laws quietly become reality. It carried a dry, bureaucratic title, Royal Decree 173/2023, regulating the military training and career of Her Royal Highness the Princess of Asturias, Doña Leonor de Borbón y Ortiz. No fanfare, no televised signing ceremony. Just a legal text, filed alongside decrees on fishing quotas and tax adjustments, in the endless administrative churn of a modern state. And yet, 3 years later, that single decree has reshaped nearly every visible dimension of Princess Leonor's life, her public identity, and the trajectory that will eventually carry her to the Spanish throne. This is the story of how a piece of paperwork became one of the most consequential interventions in the modern history of the Spanish monarchy. To understand why this decree mattered, you have to understand what problem it was solving. Spain's constitution, in Article 56, defines the king as the symbol of the state's unity and permanence, and designates him as the supreme commander of the armed forces. That military dimension of the crown is not ceremonial trivia. It is written into the structural logic of the monarchy itself. Felipe VI, before he became king, walked through all 3 military academies as Prince of Asturias, training with the army, the navy, and the air force in turn. That triple immersion was never codified into binding law for his generation. It was tradition, expectation, and personal choice, layered onto centuries of precedent about how a future head of state should be prepared. Leonor's situation was different, and considerably more delicate. She is the first woman in Spanish history to stand as heir apparent with a real, uncontested claim to inherit the throne, thanks to the constitutional ordering of succession that favors the eldest child regardless of gender, so long as no male sibling was born ahead of her under the older customary preference. She is also the first heir to face this military rite of passage under intense modern scrutiny, with every academy roll call, every uniform fitting, and every training exercise now instantly circulated on social media before the ink on any palace statement has dried. Announcing that Leonor would attend military academies, without a clear legal framework describing exactly how, would have left enormous ambiguity about her rank progression, her chain of command, her legal status as both a royal successor and a subordinate cadet, and crucially, about how the Ministry of Defense and the royal household would coordinate her unprecedented dual identity. Royal Decree 173/2023 was the government's answer to that ambiguity. It didn't simply announce that Leonor would train. It built the entire scaffolding underneath the announcement. The decree specified a structure that had never before existed in Spanish law: a full 3-year rotation through all 3 branches of the armed forces, 1 year apiece at the General Military Academy in Zaragoza, the Naval Military Academy in Marin, and the General Air and Space Academy in San Javier, Murcia. Each phase carries its own rank progression, its own uniform, its own chain of command, and its own graduation milestone. This was not cosmetic. Previous heirs, including Felipe VI himself, moved through similar institutions, but the codification of Leonor's specific pathway into a legally binding decree gave the process an authority and predictability that pure tradition never could. It meant that regardless of shifting political winds, regardless of which party controlled the Ministry of Defense, regardless of any future controversy, the roadmap for the future Queen's military formation was now locked into published law. That is a subtle but genuinely significant shift in how the Spanish state manages the construction of its future monarch. It moved the process from the realm of palace custom into the realm of enforceable statute. The decree also settled, in unambiguous legal language, a detail that might seem small but carries real symbolic weight: Leonor would renounce any salary or stipend normally due to a military cadet. On paper this looks like a minor administrative footnote. In practice, it was a calculated signal. It preemptively closed off any narrative in which critics could accuse the royal family of drawing a military paycheck on top of the already substantial public allocation the crown receives under Spain's transparency laws. In a country where Republican sentiment persists in certain political corners, and where the monarchy's public funding is periodically scrutinized in Parliament, this clause functioned as reputational insulation. It was the state, through law, immunizing the princess against a very specific and predictable line of attack before that attack could even be launched. Then there is the question of her name. Under the terms tied to her military enrollment, Leonor chose to use both parental surnames, Bourbon-Ortiz, in her official military identity, rather than simply the dynastic Bourbon alone. This detail, when you sit with it, is quietly remarkable. It folded her mother's surname, Ortiz, the surname of a woman who was a divorced television journalist before she married into the royal family, directly into the official institutional record of Spain's armed forces. It is a small act of modernization threaded through an old and rigid institution. The military academies of Spain, steeped in centuries of hierarchical tradition, now carry official documentation bearing the name Bourbon-Ortiz, a linguistic fusion of old dynastic weight and modern middle-class identity. Whether intentional or incidental, that naming choice does real symbolic work, quietly aligning the monarchy with a more contemporary, more relatable conception of royal identity. The consequences of the decree cascaded outward in ways that went well beyond the barracks. Once the legal framework was set, the honors began arriving on a predictable, almost choreographed schedule, each one timed to a training milestone the decree itself had defined. In July 2024, at the conclusion of her year in Zaragoza, King Felipe personally presented her with the Grand Cross of Military Merit with White Distinction. In July 2025, after completing her naval training at Marin and her extended transatlantic voyage aboard the tall ship Juan Sebastián de Elcano, she received the Grand Cross of Naval Merit, again presented directly by her father. And in the final chapter of her training at San Javier, the Council of Ministers approved yet another royal decree granting her the Grand Cross of Aeronautical Merit with White Distinction, the same honor Felipe himself received in 1988 when he completed his own Air Force training as Prince of Asturias. This decoration recognizes outstanding service tied to missions assigned to the armed forces or to national defense, and its distinctive white enameled cross on a white ribbon marked with 2 red stripes now sits alongside the other crosses in her growing collection. Hola. https://www.ola.com//royals/20260701910311/princess-leonor-grand-cross-aeronautical-merit/ Claude Citation 4081E8A3AO65465-8F93506501678E1 equals 3 add 0 F269-5-40858755968FA7E8E1C4. Each of these ceremonies followed the letter of the original 2023 decree almost exactly. None of them were improvised. All of them were downstream effects of a legal architecture built years earlier, in a document most people never read and most news outlets barely covered when it was first published. There's a deliberate symbolism running underneath all of this, and it's worth naming directly. The legislation provides for Spain's future queen to receive the highest honors from each branch of the armed forces as she completes each stage of her military education. Hola. https://www.ola.com//royals/20260701910311/princess-leonor-grand-cross-aeronautical-merit/ Claude Citation 4081E8A3AO65460B-8F93506501678E1 equals 64558C5AECA14774B67C2 decibels 8351 BA089, which means the decree didn't just regulate her training, it guaranteed a specific choreography of recognition, engineered to mirror her father's own path almost beat for beat. When King Felipe personally presented Leonor with her naval cross in Marin, or when the two of them were photographed flying together for the first time over Murcia in matching Pilatus training aircraft, these were not spontaneous, unscripted family moments. They were the visual, emotionally resonant payoff of a legal document signed years in advance. The decree essentially pre-wrote the choreography of dynastic continuity, ensuring that every step of Leonor's military formation would visually and symbolically echo her father's own coming of age, reinforcing to the Spanish public, consciously or not, the idea of an unbroken, legitimate line of succession stretching from Juan Carlos to Felipe to Leonor. It's also worth pausing on what the decree implicitly acknowledged about gender and precedent. Spain's 1978 constitution technically still gives preference to male heirs over female heirs of the same birth order, a lingering piece of language that has never been formally reformed despite periodic political promises to do so. Leonor holds her position only because she has no older or younger brother who could displace her under that clause. Given that reality, every institutional step that treats her identically to how a male heir would have been treated carries outsized importance. By building a decree that marched her through the exact same three-branch military gauntlet her father completed, with the exact same honors, the exact same ranks, and the exact same ceremonial gravity, the Spanish state was making an implicit argument through action rather than words, that Leonor's claim to the throne, and her preparation for it, would be treated as fully equivalent to what a son would have received. It's a workaround, in a sense, for the constitutional reform that has stalled in Spanish Parliament for years. Instead of rewriting the law of succession, the government wrote a decree that treats the female heir with total institutional parity, at least in this one crucial dimension of her formation. Beyond ceremony and symbolism, the decree also functioned as a kind of reputational risk management for the monarchy as an institution. Spain's royal family, while broadly stable and more popular than several of its European counterparts, has weathered real turbulence in the past decade. Juan Carlos I's departure from Spain amid financial scandal remains a live wound in public memory, and every misstep by a working royal gets magnified by a press ecosystem that moves at the speed of a phone notification. Leonor's military training offered the royal household a rare, almost perfectly controllable narrative opportunity: disciplined, meritocratic, physically demanding, visibly egalitarian, no salary, ordinary barracks, ordinary meals, no obvious extravagance. Every photograph that emerged from Zaragoza, Marin, and San Javier reinforced an image of a future monarch earning her position through sweat and structure rather than simply inheriting it through bloodline alone. That image did not happen by accident. It happened because Royal Decree 173/2023 built the entire framework that made those photographs possible, predictable, and perfectly timed to land in the news cycle at moments when the monarchy's reputation for discipline and service needed reinforcing. There is also a quieter, more personal transformation buried inside this legal architecture, one that's easy to miss if you're only counting medals. Leonor entered the General Military Academy in August 2023 as an 18-year-old fresh out of an international baccalaureate program in Wales, having spent her adolescence somewhat insulated from Spanish public life by years of boarding school abroad. By the time her 3 years of training concluded, she was preparing to transition into university life in Madrid, pursuing a degree in political science at Carlos III University, a program that draws together law, economics, history, sociology, and international relations, precisely the intellectual toolkit a future head of state will eventually need. Hola. https://www.ola.com//royals/20260427898128/future-queen-princess-leonor-next-step-after-military/ Claude citation 4080-1E8 a 3AO65-460B-8F935065E01678E1 equals BB7.30C6DDD 408 CB 555 to 9DD7FF0EF88F. The military years, mandated and shaped entirely by that original decree, functioned as a bridge between an adolescence spent largely outside Spain and an adulthood that will be spent almost entirely inside its institutions, its politics, and its public gaze. The decree didn't just produce medals and photo opportunities. It produced a young woman who spent 3 formative years living in barracks, eating in mess halls, standing in formation alongside cadets from Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and Ecuador, and crossing the Atlantic aboard a century-old sailing ship, all before she ever sat in a university lecture hall as Spain's future head of state. It's worth being honest about what remains uncertain here, because not every consequence of this decree is fully settled yet. Leonor's actual accession to the throne remains, by definition, dependent on events entirely outside anyone's control, namely the eventual end of her father's reign. The decree shaped her formation, not her destiny in any legally guaranteed sense. Spain's constitutional monarchy could theoretically be altered by future political developments, and periodic Republican movements in Spanish politics, however currently marginal, are a reminder that the institution itself is not immune to structural challenge. Nothing about Royal Decree 173/2023 forecloses those broader political questions. What it did do, with total certainty, was determine the concrete, day-to-day shape of 3 formative years in the life of the woman who will very likely become Spain's next queen, and it did so through a mechanism almost nobody outside legal and royal watching circles ever noticed. That, in the end, is what makes this story worth telling. We tend to imagine that monarchies transform through weddings, coronations, scandals, or funerals, the loud, photographed, unmistakably historic moments. But the deeper architecture of a modern constitutional monarchy is often built through instruments like this one, a single royal decree, filed in an official gazette on an unremarkable Tuesday in March, specifying academies and ranks and honor sequences and salary renunciations in dry bureaucratic prose. Nobody outside a small circle of legal analysts and royal correspondents paid it much attention when it was published. And yet it quietly authored the last 3 years of Princess Leonor's life, choreographed her father's proudest public moments with her, embedded a subtle argument about gender parity into the machinery of the Spanish state, and helped construct the disciplined, service-oriented public image she now carries into the next chapter of her life as a university student and, eventually, as queen. Sometimes the most consequential transformations in the life of a royal family don't happen in a cathedral or on a palace balcony. Sometimes they happen inside a single paragraph of administrative law, waiting quietly for the world to notice what it actually built.